Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I am talking about album number 3 from µ-Ziq, In Pine Effect. Alright then, we're getting back into the story of Mike Paradinas today, having already reviewed what I feel are his two best albums in Tango Invective and Bluff Limbo. It's time to move further down the catalog and into one project of his which isn't often talked about these days. Mostly because, at this current moment, the album I'll be talking about today is not legally available for streaming or digital purchase. It did see an ordinary release through the High Rise Recordings and Astral Works labels, and you can buy physical releases from resellers without too much trouble, but it's not available on any of the usual digital platforms. I will have to link an unofficial YouTube upload in the description. I'm not entirely sure what caused this album's lack of availability, assuming it's either some rights issues with the original label it was released on, or it was an issue with one of the tracks using a sample. The track Phiesope samples the track Your Ghost by Kristen Hirsch. It's possible it wasn't properly cleared, and that could have led to a similar situation like with what happened to Panther Du Prince's This Bliss in 2007, with the entire album needing to be pulled, which is a little extreme, but whatever. Though the album's liner notes do seem to imply that the sample was properly cleared, so I don't actually know the deal, but yeah. I should also mention that when I'm talking about the album today, I'll be primarily focusing on the original US CD version, since it's the easiest to find and most common version of the track listing. The one I've been most used to listening to this whole time. There are exclusive tracks on other versions, one more cut on the UK version of the CD, and 3 more on the vinyl version. I'll get to some of those later, but I haven't been able to hear all of them due to being significantly less readily available somehow. So be forewarned. But yes, In Pine Effect. This album is of course not better than either of the two that preceded it in my eyes, but if you liked those, chances are you're going to like this collection as well, since it's more or less another helping of the same kind of stuff. More frantic beats, more quirky ideas, more occasional creepy industrial atmosphere going up against other stuff with cheerier melodies. Like Bluff Limbo, there's not really much of an overarching sound to this album that really sets itself apart from his catalog, and it's kind of just a scattered selection of random ideas. Although the ideas on this one aren't quite as wildly varied as those on that album. It's kind of just another µ-Ziq album that shows Paradinas doing his usual thing just as well as he always does, if not exactly going way above and beyond. And it is plenty of fun all the way through, though I will say I feel like the first half of this album is a fair bit stronger and more consistent than the second half. We do get off to a pretty strong start in the opener, Roy Castle, a tribute to the titular TV presenter slash dancer slash singer slash actor slash trumpeter, which at first blends all these playful organ melodies with a few mechanical clangs and bangs, and later, of course, brings in some synth trumpets, and more intense banging beat work from there on. It's lots of fun, and fully delivers on the goofy tone I've always enjoyed out of this era of Paradinas' music. Really pulls me in right from the get-go. Following track Within a Sound wasn't one that stuck out to me much on initial revisit, but grew on me more and more with each passing listen. All the buzzing bass and wiry melodies going up against the typical distorted beat work absolutely slaps in all the best ways. It's really visceral and danceable, even if it isn't among his catchiest. And then we get Old Fun number 1, which builds itself on top of these really creaky sounding MIDI cello loops. At first sounding like it's trying to be on the creepier side, but of course turns out to be more of the goofy kind of Halloween spookiness, as it builds into some other sillier sounding synth string chords and melodies and more playful beatwork underneath it. The track lives up to its title and is another one of the most striking highlights for me. Next there's Dauphine, which is built around a lot of whooshing filtered breakbeats and all these squirty acid progressions and quirky alien melodic licks. Some of those beats have like this splashy quality to them that vaguely reminds me of the Orb's Blue Room, I guess. This cut doesn't bang as hard as most of the tracks that came before, but still gets my foot tapping and is just as effective at what it's going for as any other track in the first half of this album. Another track that's grown on me more and more every time I've put this thing on. And then there's Funky Pipecleaner, which builds itself on some synth chords and melodies which are markedly more unstable and unnerving sounding than you might expect from that title, but the marching beats and acidy bass lines do have a bit more bounce and swing to them, I suppose to give the track that titular funky edge to it. Maybe even has a tiny bit of a hip-hop flavor to it in certain points. Oh, and the synth trumpets come back in some parts too, which is nice. Lots of fun to be had here as per usual. Iced Gem, meanwhile, focuses on a mix of much faster-paced, skittering breakbeats, some mysterious loops of synth bells, and maybe a little bit of theremin-like synth lead in the background. Maybe the title is pushing a certain image in my mind, but I could fairly easily imagine this being used as the theme behind some ice level in an N64-era video game, even though the N64 wasn't a thing yet in 1995. Do also quite like the way this track progresses and builds into a bunch of different motifs over the course of its running time. And then that takes us to the above-mentioned track with the Kristen Hirsch sample, Phiesope. This track has always unquestionably been my favorite track in the bunch, long before I even knew there was a sample in there at all, just the way it turns that acoustic guitar and cello loop from a track that was originally fairly downbeat and minor key into this really nice and warm and friendly blend, and builds all these hip-hop breakbeats and these plinky melodies on top, which mildly resemble what he did on the similarly titled Phiesope from Tango Invective, and done even better. This cut just has this sunny and pleasant energy behind it that I don't get out of any other track he's ever done in quite the same way. On top of that, the lead synth xylophone melodies he placed on top are easily the catchiest and easiest to recall out of any track on this album. Just such a fantastic track. The album is worth hearing for this cut alone, even if it may or may not be the reason this album's currently not on any streaming services. Perhaps, unfortunately, the album does get a bit spottier after this point, and my easy favorite track on the album is followed up with my easy least favorite track on the album, Mr. Angry. I feel like this track may have come about as like a bit of a back and forth with Aphex Twin and a mutual challenge for the two of them to make the most abrasive track they could come up with. RDJ came up with his most abrasive track ever in Ventolin earlier that year, so Paradinas responded with a track comparable in abrasiveness, and built around a distorted sample of a screaming baby that just keeps playing over and over and seems to get more and more intense as the track goes along. I mean, if you put a gun to my head and told me I had to listen to one of these two tracks, I'd still pretty easily pick this over Ventolin, just because the industrial tinged beat underscoring the whole thing is markedly more danceable, and the screaming baby is still probably easier to listen to than the fucking high frequency ringing. It's also much less comically out of place in the context of this album than Ventolin was on I Care Because You Do, but man, if they aren't in a similar category of headache, and I'd still probably prefer to skip over this track in most cases. From there, the final stretch of the album is generally fine, but doesn't always stand out to me much. A track like Melanco is cool enough, but kinda repeats ideas that were on tracks like Within a Sound and Old Fun No. 1 in its synth cellos, metallic melodies, and banging industrial beats, and isn't as well done as those tracks. Pretty much have the exact same thoughts on that track as I do with the track Problematic. I guess that cut is a little better, has a bit of a bouncier edge to it, and a couple of bleepy video game synths, but kinda has the same blends of wiry industrial sounds with some screechy leads that get a bit too distorted in an unflattering way. Still wouldn't call that a major highlight either. There is one more highlight in the back half, in the sort of titled track Pine Effect. Incidentally, easily the happiest and most playful sounding cut in the second half. This cut, I believe, may mark the final contribution that Francis Naughton made to a µ-Ziq album. The way his wobbling bass lines go up against Paradinas' various mixes of cheery plinking melodies and mildly house-flavored piano solos makes for a nice little burst of childlike joy. And I guess the album's closer, Green Crumble, is nice enough as well, with its mixes of old-timey honky-tonk pianos, though it's admittedly not the most striking or memorable of closers either. Oh yeah, and I guess I gotta talk about the other version-exclusive tracks that I've heard too, since I said I was gonna do that. The UK version included one extra track not on the US version called The Wailing Song, which had to be omitted because it made the album just barely too long to fit on the standard US CD format, and required a special kind of CD which allowed some extra space but couldn't be handled by US CD players, I think. The Wailing Song is a pretty intensely spooky cut with some pretty dissonant ambience and slower beats in the mold of older tracks of his like Beatnik No. 2 or Zenith Filigree Anus maybe. I mean, it's nice, has some decently cool progression, but wouldn't be marked as one of my favorites. And there's also the vinyl version of the album, which includes 3 more exclusive tracks called Rain, Tungsten Carbide, and Frank. I I've only managed to hear Tungsten Carbide through a separate unofficial YouTube upload. Tungsten Carbide wasn't exactly a must-listen hidden gem anyway. It's cool. It's got some more especially distorted beats that are markedly slower than the other cuts on here, and some flashy melodies and chords that have a slightly poppier edge to them. Again, it's cool, but wouldn't be a big highlight either. As for the other two tracks, Rain and Frank, which I heard from someone's re-upload of them on YouTube only after recording and editing the vast majority of this video, they're also solid enough. Rain has a lot of moody synth chords, squirty acid, and minimal clapping beats. Would be one of the most downbeat cuts on this album, as I suppose its title implies. And Frank had me somewhat intrigued for being the longest cut at over 9 minutes. And it does more or less live up to the hype with all the various progressions it goes through over that time. Starting in one fairly dark place in the beginning and getting more lighthearted as it goes on, with the end not really resembling the beginning. Though this cut also has some high-pitched ringing in a few parts that I'm not crazy about either, so yeah, both tracks are good though. But yeah, that's In Pine Effect. I admittedly wouldn't put this project among the absolute best Paradinus has to offer, and obviously don't think it's nearly as essential listening as his first two albums were, but it is another very solid effort all the same. It may only have one of my all-time favorite tracks of his in Phiesope, but there's lots of well-varied ideas with his usual hard-hitting beats and his usual occasionally unnerving but still addicting melodies. It may not reveal anything about Paradinus that you wouldn't already know by this point, and it's not always his best produced work either, but there is plenty of fun to be had here. It kind of establishes the usual baseline of quality that you could expect from him going forward for the rest of his career, even when he'd take his sound in a different territory. It's not a great album in my eyes, but it is very good, and I'd say it's worth a shot if you're interested. So, yeah, I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on this one. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.